It started with a bill. He had always been careful with his electricity. Living alone, he had no reason to use much, just the basics. A few lights, a TV now and then, and his coffee maker in the morning. No big appliances running all day, no unnecessary devices plugged in. He had been paying around the same amount every month for years. But then, one day, he opened his latest bill and froze. The numbers didn't make sense. Triple what he usually paid. At first, he thought it was a mistake. Maybe an issue with the electric company? A quick call to customer service confirmed otherwise. "Sir, the meter reading is correct," the woman on the phone said. "Your usage has significantly increased over the last few weeks. Are you running any new appliances?" No. That was the strange part. Nothing had changed. So, where was all this extra electricity going? He hung up the phone and started checking his house. He walked from room to room, looking for anything that could be secretly draining power. He checked the fridge, the lights, even the water heater. Nothing unusual. But the bill was still climbing. Then, he had a thought: was someone stealing from him? It sounded crazy at first. How could anyone even do that? His house was a standalone home, no shared meters, no attached units. But something felt off. That night, he stepped outside to take a look around. The street was quiet, just a few porch lights glowing in the distance. He walked to the side of his house where the power meter was, squinting in the dim light. And that's when he saw it. A cable. A long, thick extension cord running from his outdoor outlet, straight into his neighbor's yard. He followed it with his eyes, heart pounding. The cord disappeared over the fence, into the property next door. His neighbor's house. It took him a moment to process what he was seeing. Someone was stealing his electricity. And he had a pretty good idea who it was. His next-door neighbor had a reputation: difficult, entitled, and always looking for ways to cut corners. People in the neighborhood called her a Karen, and she lived up to the name. Complaining about noise that didn't exist. Starting fights over parking spots. Acting as if she owned the entire street. And now, apparently, she had decided she was entitled to free electricity, too. He clenched his jaw. Unbelievable. But he didn't storm over there right away. No. If she thought she could steal from him and get away with it, she had another thing coming. Instead of unplugging the cord, instead of knocking on her door and demanding an explanation, he stood there in the dark and smiled. He was going to teach her a lesson. A lesson she would never forget. The next morning, he woke up with a plan. He knew that simply confronting Karen wouldn't work. She had a history of denying things, arguing, and playing the victim. If he accused her now, she'd probably claim she had no idea what he was talking about or, worse, say it was an accident. No, he needed proof. So, before heading to work, he stopped by a local electronics store and bought a small hidden camera. It was motion-activated, the kind you could set up and forget. Perfect for catching someone in the act. That night, after making sure the coast was clear, he installed it near his outdoor outlet. Small, discreet, impossible to notice. He set it to record whenever there was movement near the plug. Then, he waited. The next morning, he checked the footage. And there it was. The video showed Karen, sneaking into his yard late at night, plugging in the extension cord. She moved quickly, like she'd done it 100 times before. No hesitation, no guilt. Just plug and go. He watched in disbelief as she stole his electricity right in front of his eyes. The nerve. But it got worse. He started talking to other neighbors, casually bringing up the subject of strange electricity spikes. And to his surprise, he wasn't the only victim. Karen had been pulling tricks on multiple people. One neighbor, an elderly man named Frank, mentioned that his outdoor light mysteriously stopped working a few months ago. When he checked, the wires had been tampered with. Another woman, Linda, said her shed lights had been flickering lately, and when her husband checked the wiring, they found an extra cord that wasn't theirs. Karen was stealing from everyone. The more he heard, the angrier he got. But it wasn't just anger. It was determination. He wasn't just going to stop her. He was going to make sure she never did it again. So, he planned his next move. That night, instead of unplugging the cord, he left it exactly as it was. But he added something new. He attached a small voltage meter to track how much electricity she was using. He also checked the breaker box, making sure he had full control of the power flow to that particular outlet. Then, he set up an alarm notification on his phone. Whenever the plug was used, he would know instantly. Now, he just had to wait for the right moment to strike. And when the moment came, it would be glorious. The next night, he didn't go to sleep as usual. He waited, watching the live feed from his hidden camera. The phone in his hand buzzed softly, a notification. Karen was back. She moved quickly, like always. Wearing a hoodie this time, as if that would somehow make her less recognizable. She reached for the extension cord, plugged it in, and hurried back over the fence. Gotcha. He took a deep breath. It was time. Instead of just cutting the power or pulling the plug, he grabbed a flashlight and walked straight to her door. No more waiting. He knocked hard. No answer. He knocked again. Louder this time. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door swung open. There she stood, Karen. Her expression twisted in irritation, as if he was the one bothering her. What do you want? She snapped, crossing her arms. He held up his phone. You want to explain this? Her eyes flickered to the screen, and he could see it, the split-second moment of panic before she masked it with an exaggerated scoff. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, feigning confusion. He turned the phone around so she could get a better look at herself in the footage. Really? He said, voice calm. Because this looks exactly like you plugging in an extension cord to my house. Again. Her lips tightened. That's not me. He almost laughed at the sheer boldness of the lie. Karen, he said, barely holding back his frustration. I have you on camera. I've been watching you do this for weeks. I even set up a meter to track how much power you're stealing. So don't waste my time pretending you don't know what's going on. She huffed and waved a dismissive hand. Oh, please. It's just a little electricity. You wouldn't even notice if you weren't so nosy. That was it. The arrogance. The entitlement. He took a deep breath, steadying his anger. You need to unplug it. Right now, he said, voice firm. Karen rolled her eyes. Oh, come on. It's just temporary. I had she fumbled for an excuse. My mother is sick, okay? She needs a breathing machine, and my electricity is unreliable. Are you really going to let an old woman suffer? That was the biggest lie yet. Her mother didn't even live with her. He shook his head. Cut the act, Karen. I already talked to the other neighbors. You've been pulling this stunt with multiple houses. Her expression darkened. You're spying on me now? No, he said, tired of the games. I'm catching you stealing. She crossed her arms and glared. What are you gonna do? Call the cops over a little electricity? Go ahead. They won't care. His patience snapped. You sure about that? He said, taking a step forward. Because the power company definitely cares. You know what they call this? Theft. And they have laws for people who steal utilities. Her smirk faltered for the first time. He continued, voice sharp. They can fine you. Cut your power completely. Even charge you for fraud. Karen swallowed, the reality finally sinking in. But she wasn't done playing games. You wouldn't do that, she said, though she didn't sound as sure as before. He folded his arms. Try me. For a moment, there was silence. Then, her eyes narrowed. "You're such a miserable old man," she spat. "Always sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. No wonder no one in the neighborhood likes you." Ah. The insults. A classic move from someone who knew they were losing. He didn't even flinch. "Unplug it, Karen. Or I make the call." She clenched her jaw, her nostrils flaring. Finally, with a dramatic sigh, she turned and stormed back toward her yard. A few seconds later, the notification on his phone disappeared. She had unplugged the cord. He exhaled. Victory. Or so he thought. Because when he woke up the next morning, the notification was back. Karen had plugged it in again. She had learned nothing. That's when he knew she wasn't going to stop. And if she thought she could steal from him twice, then it was time for Plan B. A plan she wouldn't see coming. The next morning, he sat at his kitchen table, sipping coffee, staring at the alert on his phone. She plugged it in again. He had given her a chance, a warning, a confrontation, even an easy way out. But no, she wasn't done. Karen was bold enough to keep stealing from him, as if his words had meant nothing. Fine. She wanted to play games? He'd play. But on his terms. Setting the trap. He needed something that would stop her once and for all. Something that would teach her a lesson, but without breaking the law or getting himself in trouble. Then an idea struck. He still had an old solar power inverter stored in his garage, one that could modify the electricity output. With a few adjustments, he could make it harmlessly zap anyone who tried to use the extension cord. Nothing dangerous, nothing illegal. Just a small but painful shock. Enough to scare the entitlement out of her. That evening, he got to work. He carefully rewired the outdoor outlet, routing the power through the inverter. The next time Karen plugged in her cord, instead of getting free electricity, she'd get a jolt of regret. Then, he waited. The first shock. Around 10:45 p.m., his phone vibrated with the alert. She was back. The camera feed showed her sneaking over, just like before. Plugging in the extension cord without a second thought. Then, bzzzt. A loud yelp echoed across the yard. Karen jerked her hand away, shaking it furiously. She stumbled back, looking around in a panic, as if trying to figure out what had just happened. He had to bite his lip to keep from laughing. She stood there, rubbing her fingers, scowling at the outlet. She hesitated, then tried again. Bzzzt. Another yelp. She cursed under her breath, shaking her hand even harder this time. On the camera feed, she glared at his house, hands on her hips, muttering angrily. She stood there for a few seconds, debating, then stormed back inside. Round 1, him. But she wasn't done. He thought that would be the end of it. That she'd realize it wasn't worth the trouble and finally stop. But no. The next night, she was back. Only this time, she came prepared. On the camera, he saw her wearing rubber gloves. Unbelievable. She wasn't giving up, she was problem-solving. She carefully reached for the extension cord, moving slower this time. She plugged it in, and nothing happened. Or so she thought. What she didn't know was that he had added another trick. The inverter now delivered the shock in randomized intervals, instead of immediately. She might get lucky once, maybe even twice, but sooner or later. Bzzzt. A scream. She jumped back, nearly falling over. This time, she kicked the cord away like it was a snake. He grinned. Perfect. She had no idea what was going on. To her, it must have seemed like the outlet was cursed, 1 minute working fine, the next minute attacking her. On the camera, she paced back and forth, visibly frustrated. Then she did what she always did when things didn't go her way, she got angry. The final straw. The next night, she came back again. But instead of sneaking over, she stormed right up to his front door. Bang! 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 The loud knocking echoed through the house. He took his time answering. When he opened the door, Karen stood there, fuming. She pointed an accusing finger at him. "What the hell did you do to your outlet?" He blinked. "Excuse me?" She crossed her arms, scowling. "I don't know what you did, but every time I try to use that plug, I get shocked. That's illegal, you know. You can't tamper with electricity like that." He raised an eyebrow. "You mean my electricity? On my property?" Her face twitched. It's dangerous. Someone could get hurt." He leaned against the doorframe, arms folded. "You mean like someone who's trespassing and stealing power that they weren't invited to use?" She went silent for a moment. Then, she doubled down. "I don't know what you're talking about," she huffed. "I was just trying to use an outlet. It's outside. That means it's for public use." He stared at her. Was she serious? "That's not how it works," he said, shaking his head. "That outlet is on my house. It's powered by my account. You don't get to just help yourself." Karen scoffed. "Oh, come on. Electricity is expensive. You probably don't even notice the extra cost." He stepped closer. "I noticed when my bill tripled." She waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, please. You can afford it." That was it. That entitled attitude. Like his money was somehow her money. Like she had the right to decide what he could afford to lose. He took a deep breath. "Karen, I gave you a warning. I asked you to stop. You didn't. So I fixed the problem myself." She narrowed her eyes. "You think this is funny?" "A little." She clenched her fists, nostrils flaring. Then she jabbed a finger toward his yard. "I'll have you know, I could report you." "What if a kid got shocked?" "Huh? Ever think of that?" He sighed. "There's no kid sneaking into my yard in the middle of the night to steal electricity." She huffed loudly. "You're such a miserable old man. No wonder nobody in this neighborhood likes you." Ah, there it was again. He smirked. "Funny. The neighbors I talked to seem to like me just fine." Her face froze. For the first time, she looked nervous. He took a step forward. "Oh yeah, I spoke with Frank. And Linda. Turns out, I wasn't the only one you were stealing from." Karen swallowed. "Now, here's what's going to happen," he continued, voice low and firm. "You're going to stay away from my house. You're not going to touch my outlet again. And if I catch you or anyone else messing with my power, I'll be making 2 phone calls, one to the police, and one to the electric company." Her jaw clenched. "You wouldn't." He grinned. "Try me." For the first time, she had no comeback. She just stood there, fuming, teeth clenched. Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and stomped back to her house. Was she finally done? Maybe. But he had a feeling this wasn't over just yet. The next few days were quiet. Too quiet. Karen had gone radio silent, and for the first time in weeks, the alerts on his phone stopped. No more sneaky plugins. No more stolen electricity. Had she finally learned her lesson? Not a chance. Because people like Karen didn't just give up. They retaliated. And sure enough, it didn't take long for her to try something new. The retaliation. One morning, as he stepped outside to take out the trash, he noticed something strange. His lawn. It was trashed. Garbage bags had been dumped all over. Empty food wrappers, plastic bottles, even an old rusty tire sat in the middle of his yard. It was deliberate, someone had done this on purpose. And he didn't need a detective to know who. Karen. She must have waited until he was asleep, then dumped her own trash onto his property out of spite. His blood boiled. This woman was unbelievable. She had been stealing from him, he caught her, and now she was mad at him? Fine. She wanted a fight? She was going to get one. But he wasn't going to stoop to her level. No yelling, no arguing, no pointless drama. He was going to end this once and for all. The public exposure. Instead of confronting her directly, he decided to expose her in the worst way possible, public humiliation. He grabbed his phone and uploaded everything to the neighborhood's private Facebook group. The hidden camera footage? Posted. The proof of his electricity bill skyrocketing? Posted. A clear message calling her out? Posted. But the best part? He attached a few screenshots from other neighbors. Because after hearing his story, others started coming forward too. Frank, the elderly neighbor, posted about his missing electricity and tampered wires. Linda shared how her backyard lights had stopped working mysteriously. Even a younger couple on the next street said they had noticed extension cords disappearing from their shed. Karen wasn't just stealing from him. She was stealing from everyone. And now? The entire neighborhood knew. The fallout. The post blew up within hours. Comments started pouring in. Wow, I knew she was entitled, but this is next level. She's been stealing from all of us? Call the cops. Enough is enough. Someone needs to report her to the power company. The public humiliation was brutal. Karen's reputation had been ruined overnight. And she knew it. Because later that afternoon, she came storming over to his house again. Bang! 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 The knocking was so aggressive, it rattled the windows. He took his time answering. When he finally opened the door, there she was. Red-faced, fuming, shaking with rage. Her arms were wildly flailing as she shouted. How dare you post that online? He crossed his arms. Everything in that post was true. She jabbed a finger toward his chest. That was private. You're making me look bad. You did that to yourself, he said flatly. She sputtered in frustration. You think you're so clever, don't you? You think you can just humiliate me in front of the whole neighborhood? He shrugged. Looks like it worked. Her eyes burned with fury. You are going to delete that post right now, she shrieked. Or else. He cut her off. Or else what? You'll steal more electricity? Dump more trash on my lawn? Her mouth snapped shut. She had no comeback. That's when he played his final card. I already filed a report, he said calmly. Her face drained of color. With who? She whispered. The electric company. They're sending an inspector tomorrow. She stumbled back. You wouldn't. Oh, I would, he said, voice steady. Because stealing electricity is a crime, Karen. And after what you've done to me and everyone else? You deserve to be held accountable. For the first time since this mess started, she looked genuinely afraid. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She knew she was trapped. Then, with a final glare, she turned and stormed away. But for the first time? She wasn't storming off in victory. She was running away in defeat. And he had a feeling that for Karen, this was just the beginning of her problems. The next morning, he woke up early. Today was inspection day. The electric company had taken his complaint seriously. After reviewing his proof, security footage, usage records, and neighbor testimonies, they scheduled a technician to come out and investigate. And best of all? They didn't just check his house. They inspected Karen's too. The inspection. Around 10 a.m., a white service van pulled up. Two uniformed men stepped out, toolkits in hand, and walked straight toward his meter. He greeted them and handed over his footage and complaint records. One of the technicians, a man named Rick, frowned as he scrolled through the evidence. This is bad, he muttered. Tampering with electrical connections is a serious violation. The other worker nodded. Yeah, this could get her fined, or even have her power disconnected entirely. He felt a wave of satisfaction. Finally, Karen was going to face real consequences. Karen's meltdown. As expected, she didn't take it well. The moment the inspectors stepped into her yard, she came flying out of her house. "What are you doing?" she screeched. One of the workers turned to her calmly. "Ma'am, we're conducting an inspection. We have reason to believe unauthorized power tapping has been occurring from your property." Karen's face twitched. "That's ridiculous. I pay my bills just fine. This is harassment." Rick raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, we have video evidence of you plugging an extension cord into your neighbor's outlet." Her face went completely red. That's a lie." The second inspector ignored her tantrum and began checking her power meter. After a few minutes, he whistled. "Yep. Tampered connection." Karen froze. She knew what that meant. "Ma'am," Rick said firmly, "this is a serious violation. Not only have you been stealing power from your neighbor, but you've also illegally bypassed part of your own meter. This could result in a heavy fine, or even service disconnection." Karen's mouth fell open. "Wait, no, you can't do that. That's my electricity." The second inspector looked up. "Ma'am, you weren't using your own electricity. You were using his. And based on our readings, you've likely done this to other properties too." The color drained from her face. He watched, arms crossed, enjoying every second of her meltdown. You don't understand," she stammered. "I didn't mean to. It was a mistake." Rick sighed. "Ma'am, stealing electricity isn't a mistake. It's a crime." She stared at them, panicked. Then, she turned to him. Her eyes were desperate now, filled with pleading. "Please," she whispered. "Tell them it was a misunderstanding. We're neighbors. We don't have to go this far." He tilted his head. "Oh? So now we're neighbors?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. He folded his arms. "Karen, for weeks, you've been stealing from me. You trashed my lawn. You insulted me. You mocked me. And when I caught you, you doubled down instead of apologizing." She swallowed hard. He looked back at the inspectors. "Do whatever you need to do." Karen's panic exploded into fury. "You can't do this to me," she shrieked. "You're a miserable old man. You just love making people suffer." Rick ignored her rant. "We'll be issuing an official citation, and a fine will be sent to your billing address. If we find additional violations, there may be further penalties." Then, in one final blow, the second inspector walked over to Karen's power box and cut the seal. "We're also placing a hold on your service for review. Until this is sorted, your power will remain disconnected." Karen's scream was deafening. "You can't just shut off my electricity." Rick shrugged. "You weren't paying for it anyway." Then, without another word, the inspectors packed up their tools and left. The aftermath. By the time they were gone, Karen looked destroyed. For the first time since this started, she was completely powerless, literally and figuratively. She turned back to him, seething. "This isn't over," she hissed. He smirked. "Oh, I think it is." She stormed back inside, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. But now? Now, he knew she had lost. For weeks, she had thought she could get away with stealing. Thought she could bully and manipulate her way out of it. But now, the whole neighborhood knew the truth. The power company had penalized her. And with her reputation in tatters, she had no one left to manipulate. She was finally getting what she deserved. And the best part? It wasn't over yet. Because the final lesson was still to come. The next few days were blissfully quiet. For the first time in weeks, he could walk into his kitchen, make coffee, and check his electricity bill without feeling that knot of frustration in his stomach. Karen was gone. Well, not literally gone, she was still in her house. But she had gone completely silent. No more sneaky thefts. No more trash on his lawn. No more banging on his door screaming at him. Because now? She had bigger problems. The electric company had cut her service indefinitely. Until she paid her massive fine and had a full meter inspection, she wasn't getting her power back. And from what he had heard, she had no money to pay. The fallout. The whole neighborhood had turned against her. After the inspectors left, his Facebook post exploded. More neighbors came forward with their own experiences. Some had lost Wi-Fi unexpectedly and later realized Karen had messed with the underground cables. Others had missing tools from their sheds. It wasn't just electricity Karen had been stealing. It was everything. She had burned so many bridges that even the homeowners association got involved. And if there was one thing Karen hated, it was people with more power than her. The HOA sent her a formal violation letter. Between her power theft, her illegal yard modifications, and her never-ending complaints against other residents, they had plenty of reasons to start an eviction process. Karen was on her last strike. And she knew it. Her pathetic plea. That's why, a few days later, she came back. But this time? She wasn't angry. She was desperate. Late one evening, just as he was settling in to watch TV, he heard a soft knock on his door. Not the usual loud, aggressive banging. A hesitant, almost nervous knock. Curious, he walked over and peered through the peephole. Karen. He opened the door slowly, arms crossed. She looked terrible. Dark circles under her eyes. Messy hair. No makeup. It looked like she hadn't slept in days. Can we talk? She muttered. He raised an eyebrow. About what? She sighed deeply. I messed up, okay, she admitted. I wasn't thinking. I didn't think it was that big of a deal. But now. She hesitated, glancing back at her house. I have no electricity. My fridge is off. My food is spoiling. I can't even charge my phone. Her voice softened. I don't know what to do. He watched her carefully. Was this real remorse? Or just another trick? She chewed her lip, staring at the ground. I can't afford the fine. I don't have the money. And now, the HOA is on my back. They're talking about trying to get me kicked out. She finally looked up at him, eyes pleading. I know I was awful. I was mean. And I shouldn't have done what I did. But I don't have anyone else to ask. Her voice was almost pathetic now. I need help. The choice. For a brief moment, he was silent. She had spent weeks stealing from him. Lied to his face. Tried to ruin his reputation. Trashed his yard out of spite. And now? Now she wanted help? A big part of him wanted to slam the door in her face. Let her suffer. Let her learn the hard way that her actions had consequences. But then? Then, he thought about the bigger picture. She was still his neighbor. And while she was an entitled, selfish person, people could change. He wasn't about to let her off the hook entirely. But maybe, just maybe, there was still a lesson she could learn. The deal. He took a deep breath. You need help? He said. She nodded quickly. Yes. Anything. I'll do anything. He raised an eyebrow. Anything? She hesitated but nodded again. Yes. All right, he said. Here's the deal. She straightened up, listening. I'll help you cover your fine, he said. And I'll help you get your power back on. Her eyes lit up with relief. Oh, thank you. But. The word hit like a brick wall. She froze. But. You're going to pay me back. Every cent. She blinked. Oh, okay. That's fair. And, he continued, you're going to make things right with the neighborhood. She frowned. What do you mean? I mean, you're going to apologize to every single person you screwed over, he said. In person. One by one. Her face paled. And, he added, you're going to do some community service. Her lips parted in shock. What? You're going to clean up the mess you made. You dumped trash on my lawn? You're going to clean up the whole neighborhood. You messed with people's utilities? You're going to volunteer to help elderly neighbors with household repairs. You don't get a free pass, Karen. She looked stunned. She swallowed. I don't know if I can do that. Then you don't get my help. Silence. She stared at him, struggling. Then, finally, she sighed in defeat. Fine. The lesson learned. Over the next few weeks, Karen kept her word. With his help, she worked out a payment plan for her fine. It took some effort, but eventually, the electric company restored her power. More importantly, she changed. It wasn't easy, but she started apologizing. One by one, she visited every neighbor she had wronged. Some slammed the door in her face. Others were hesitant but listened. And slowly, she started making amends. She helped Frank fix his broken garden lights. She cleaned up the mess she made in his yard. She even volunteered at a local shelter, helping struggling families. It took time. But eventually, people started forgiving her. Was she perfect? No. But she was better. And that? That was the real victory. The final thought. One evening, as he stood outside watering his plants, Karen walked by. She paused. Hey, she said awkwardly. He glanced up. Hey. She hesitated. Then, after a moment, she gave a small smile. Thanks, she muttered. For, not ruining my life. He smirked. You ruined it yourself. I just held up a mirror. She rolled her eyes, but chuckled. Yeah. Well, thanks anyway. And then? She walked away. No insults. No attitude. Just a normal human interaction. And that? That was the real lesson. The end. The silence in the neighborhood was different now. It wasn't the tense, passive-aggressive kind that had settled in during the weeks of Karen's power theft, nor was it the charged, expectant hush that followed her public humiliation. No, this was a different kind of quiet. A quiet that signaled a shift. But not just for Karen. For everyone. Because for the first time in years, the neighborhood stood together. The last stand. The morning after Karen's dramatic meltdown, he woke up early, not out of stress, but out of curiosity. Would she actually go through with it? Would she truly own up to what she had done? Or would she find a way to wriggle out, make excuses, turn the tables again? He didn't have to wait long to find out. By mid-morning, Karen was outside with a garbage bag in each hand. She wasn't just cleaning his yard, she was cleaning everyone's. It was a sight no one had ever expected to see. Karen. The woman who had spent years making life difficult for her neighbors. The woman who once called the police because a kid's bicycle was left near her driveway. The woman who stole without guilt and lied without hesitation. Now? She was picking up old beer cans from Frank's yard. Scrubbing the chalk graffiti off the sidewalk in front of Linda's house. Pulling weeds from the community garden, a place she had once complained about because it was too messy. At first, people stared. No one quite believed it was real. But then? Something even more unexpected happened. A new Karen emerges. It started small. Frank, the elderly neighbor who had once been one of Karen's biggest victims, walked outside with a cold glass of lemonade. He shuffled over and held it out to her. She hesitated. Then, cautiously, she took it. Thanks, she muttered. Frank simply nodded and went back inside. A few houses down, Linda, the neighbor whose backyard lights had mysteriously stopped working, came outside with a rake. She didn't say a word. She just started helping. Within an hour, 3 more neighbors joined in. Not because they had to, but because something was happening. Something real. And for the first time in as long as anyone could remember, Karen wasn't standing against the neighborhood. She was standing with it. An unexpected moment. By the end of the afternoon, Karen looked exhausted. Her once pristine nails were dirty. Her hair was messy. Sweat dripped down her forehead. But she kept going. By sunset, the neighborhood was spotless. And when she finally stood up straight, stretching her aching back, she turned and saw something she never expected. People were watching. Not with judgment. Not with gloating amusement. But with something close to respect. For the first time in her entire life, Karen had done something for someone else. And people noticed. And maybe, just maybe, for the first time, she felt what it was like to be a part of something. The real apology. That night, as he was locking up his house, he heard footsteps approaching. He turned to see Karen standing at the edge of his porch. But this time? She wasn't angry. She wasn't defensive. She wasn't entitled. She looked different. Smaller. Softer. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice that was quiet, almost fragile, she finally said it. "I'm sorry." No excuses. No backtracking. No trying to shift the blame. Just 2 simple words. She took a deep breath. I was awful to you. To everyone. And I don't have an excuse. She hesitated, looking away. I don't know why I am the way I am. I always felt like people were against me. And I guess I started acting like it was me against the world. She let out a bitter chuckle. Turns out, that's a pretty lonely way to live. He didn't say anything. Because what could he say? So instead, he did something Karen never would have expected. He stepped aside and opened the door. Want a cup of coffee? Her eyes widened slightly. What? I figure after a long day of cleaning up a whole neighborhood, you probably need one, he said simply. For a moment, she just stood there. Then, hesitantly, she stepped inside. And in that moment, for the first time in years, Karen wasn't just his neighbor. She was human. The final lesson. The weeks that followed weren't a miraculous transformation. Karen didn't suddenly turn into a saint. She was still Karen. She still had a sharp tongue. Still had opinions about everything. Still grumbled when kids rode their bikes too close to her car. But there was a difference. She stopped cutting corners. She stopped looking for ways to cheat her way through life. And most importantly, she stopped treating people like enemies. The neighborhood forgave her. Slowly. It took time. But one day, he noticed something that made him smile. Karen, standing in her front yard, chatting with Frank. Not arguing. Not complaining. Just talking. And maybe, just maybe, for the first time, Karen had finally learned what it meant to be part of a community. The final thought. One evening, months later, as he was fixing a loose fence post, he felt a presence behind him. He turned to see Karen standing there, arms crossed, looking uncomfortable. Need a hand? She asked. He raised an eyebrow. You offering? She sighed. I mean, don't expect me to be good at it, but yeah. He handed her a wrench. All right, Karen. Let's see what you've got. She rolled her eyes, but smirked. And as they worked side by side, something strange happened. For the first time in all the years they had been neighbors. They laughed. Because at the end of the day, it wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about winning. It was about teaching a lesson. And sometimes, the best lessons change more than just one person. The end.